Testing 1, 2, 3. So good evening, class. My name is Selena, and this evening I want to touch base on the topic of the adjustment domain, which is chapter 12 that we had studied within this course. First thing I want to mention is that this specific chapter caught my attention because I believe adjustment and coping, not only in the professional field but for personal wise, is super important to speak about. And so when we get into more depth about the adjustment domain, what that is explaining is adjusting within a specific area of our lives. And so first we want to talk about who, right? Well, who is in the adjustment area? Who's in the area of coping through, life events that have been happening or have happened in a person's life? As we all know, events take place in our lives on a daily basis, and some are just totally unavoidable, and we have to live our lives just going through these situations. And so when we speak in terms of who, right? We're talking about individuals who are having to adjust to change and being able to cope with the specific situation that's occurring or reoccurring in their life. And so we want to talk about what, right? Well, what does adjustment mean? According to the text that Eric has explained, is that adjustment is relatively significant changes in an individual's behavior and experiences in a response to external and internal challenges, which are known as the process of adjustment. And then from adjustment we go to coping, right? We have to cope to the adjustment that's taking place. So then, as Eric stated within the text, that coping is the process of coping deliberately and conscious efforts to an adjustment of a challenge, a changing situation, and new conditions that may be occurring in an individual's life. And then we may ask where, right? Where does adjustment and coping take place? Well, during life transitions such as the birth of a child, marriage, divorce. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be marriage. It could be loss or change of a job. It can be financial difficulties, responsibilities, the loss of a home, attending college, receiving a promotion within a job. So adjustment can take place in both negative and positive areas within our life. And so we may ask when, right? When does adjustment and coping come into place? Well, that's when we have to come to the conclusion that having to adjust to a life crisis, it could be before, during, or after. And then it's when coping comes into place of how do we cope? How do we cope with the situation that's occurring in our lives? And again, we cope with negative things that happen in our life, positive things that happen in our life, which are the examples that I had just given to you all. And so transition can become unavoidable. Therefore, that is when the coping process comes into exercise. And so, as stated within the text, when we're speaking in terms of avoiding, it means keeping ourselves away from addressing a challenge or stressor and distracting our minds from a situation that is taking place within our lives. And so what I'll go ahead and do is I will go ahead and talk about some examples and ways that we cope with situations in a negative aspect. And so that may be overeating, undereating, isolation and depression. It can also be the use of alcohol or drugs, which are one of the really high negative coping areas that people tend to fall into. And so it may also consist of not getting enough sleep, overworking, When I mean overworking, taking on extra shifts, someone calls in and they say, hey, can you come in? You're that person who's just always willing to go in to work and always pick up that extra shift or stay later from work, because that may be your way of coping. You could be working 2 jobs. Let's see here. You could be getting burnt out from overworking. Overall, just distracting your mind to face the reality of adjustment that has been taking place within your life. And so, there are times in life where we do cope in, these examples that I have just explained, but also we can also cope in positive ways as well. And so I will go ahead and give a few examples of coping in a positive aspect. And so that all goes back to self-care, caring for ourselves, right? Because again, life happens, transition happens, going back to, marriage, divorce, loss of a job, and so on. These things take place, and sometimes these events that take place, sometimes we don't have control over these things, like loss of a loved one. We don't have control of that, but the way that we respond to that is super important. And so going back to explaining what positive coping is, we can do painting, we can do journaling, we can seek social support from a counselor, from a therapist, from family, from friends that we trust, a religious group, exercising, we can eat healthy, getting enough sleep, reading a book, listening to music, praying, and meditating. And so why is it important, to cope with the situations or adjustments that are taking place in our lives? We may ask that, right? Why is it so important? Well, we as humans are impacted by adjustment in the way in which we think, our emotional responses, and our behavior to the situation that's occurring. We are human, we have to feel, we have to think, and we have to act on a situation that's happening. Again, as I had mentioned in the beginning, it can be avoidable. You can cope with the situation in a negative way, but it's not healthy. And sometimes it's life and that's what happens. But when we're able to cope with the situation in a positive aspect, it's more of a relief from ourselves. And so the way I like to cope, and I thought I would share this with you all, is the room I'm in right now. I actually recently renovated it in terms of, I painted it, I put up some paintings, I journal in here, I do my homework in here, I try and exercise in here, whether it's meditating for a few minutes, half an hour or so. I like to read, and recently I've been trying to get into the habit of reading, and so I'll show you just a few things that I do. So journaling, this is my journal. I like to journal in this when I'm going through a really rough time. I take the time out of my day to just sit here and express the way I'm feeling or how I'm responding to a situation, as well as reading. So I like to read books. This is one of the books that I'm currently trying to get into. And recently I just ordered 2 new books, which is called I Love You More, which are short stories of addiction, recovery, and loss from the family's perspective. So I have a lot of family members who struggle with addiction, and sometimes it's really difficult for me to cope with the things that I see in my family. And so I thought, well, maybe I can get some books to get more education and understanding of, knowing that I'm not alone, pretty much, and so that's one book. Also, because I am studying substance abuse counseling, I am going into that field. And I also got another book which is called Trauma Takes a Loss, My Story, My Trauma, and Our Healing. And so those are the ways in which I cope. And so I feel that coping is super important to apply to our lives. I wish I would have known this since way before. And so right now, I'm an advocate for women of domestic violence, and so I work in a shelter setting. And so a lot of the women that we get into our shelter, a lot of them are under the feeling of being depressed because of the situation that they're going through. And so my job as an advocate is to provide my clients with coping skills. And so the coping skills, which are the positive ones that I had already explained to you all, I try and stress those coping skills onto my clients so that way they know that, for one, they're not alone. Two, there's not always the road to coping with the situation in a negative way, and there's always other matters. And so we train our we work very closely with our clients on these exercises and ways of coping. And so that's pretty much it. And I just want to say thank you all for all your feedback and all the positive information that you have placed in your discussions, and that they were just super important to be familiar with, and that you all have the safe holidays and safe during this difficult time. This is a good example. We're going through COVID right now, right? And so it's hard to cope with knowing that either we're really maybe feeling alone, we're stuck at home, we're used to working, we're away from family and friends. And so coping now in a time of crisis where it's unavoidable, right? We can't avoid the whole coronavirus, which is insane. I hate it. We all do. But just finding some things that are beneficial to your coping and adjustment to this situation. And so that's all I have. Thanks, guys.